John Dunn has had a busy TV season designing the costumes on Dickinson, the new Apple TV series about famed poet Emily Dickinson, as well as on Hunters, starring Al Pacino as the leader of a group of vigilantes hunting Nazis plotting to create a Fourth Reich in 1970s New York. That's a lot to take in. I'm Rob Licuria, Senior Editor here at Gold Derby, and John, I'm not sure you could have possibly chosen two more disparate genres to work in than these two. Was this TV season one of the most rewarding for you because of the two different periods that you got to tackle?
I would say yes, absolutely. It was, I look for projects that are maybe a topic that has been covered once or twice before, but that is covering it in a whole new way that's never been seen before. And it just happened within the same season. Both Dickinson and Hunters reared their heads, and I was able to work on both of them. And I literally found that they were very, very different, but at the same time, what I was drawn to was the fact that they really were taking a new look at something that had already, or someone who had already been sort of stereotyped or just sort of frozen in time as to who we thought they were, in the case of, say, Emily Dickinson.
So when we think of period work, we immediately think of big bonnets and dresses and bows, but of course, period work can be quite diverse, and I would have thought even more so on Dickinson because it takes place in the 1850s, but it's told in a very modern and contemporary way in both its look and its tone. So how did Elena Smith's choices in mixing things up for Dickinson inform your work on that show?
Well, when I talked to Elena, she was very much interested in doing a fresh look at this part of that decade or of that century. And but on the other hand, she really loved the silhouette and the correct period details. She loves that details that we put in with those sorts of costumes, and it's a period that she's very fond of. But I knew we needed to find a way that would be newer and fresher, and I realized as I researched the show, which involved looking at a great deal of artwork and photography and reading a great deal, that what was interesting about doing 1850 was we have this very, I guess you'd call it a very stereotypic feel of how things looked in those periods, and largely that's influenced by the photography, which has come to us primarily in black and white and sepia tones. And so there's this whole sense of that period being very muted and black and browns, and because we were going to try to do a fresh take on it, I stumbled upon the fact that in fact in the 1850s they were using insane colors. They were mixing, incredible patterns of paisleys and stripes and florals all in the same outfit. And that was very much the mode at the time, 1850. And so I thought, well, that will be really sort of cool and fresh, because everyone, when we see so many of these dramas set in the 1850s, 1860s, it's the Victorian era, but it is also heavily influenced by Victoria's going into deep mourning in the 1860s because of the death of Prince Albert, and of course in the United States because of the Civil War in the 1860s. So that's when the country got plunged into dark, dreary clothing. And by going back a little earlier than 1850s, it was, I had, while being totally accurate to the period, I was able to use colors and patterns that were quite unusual for what we were used to looking at for things that were taking place in the 1850s in television and in film.
Yeah, it's so interesting when you say that, because to me, the costume designer, the production designer, and probably hair and makeup have to almost be like historians, because you've got to do your research. You've got to be true to the period. you may want to mix it up a bit, obviously, and put your own aesthetic on it. But in the process of world building, those departments have to work so closely together, along with the DP, I would assume, and the editor and everybody else. So how collaborative does a project like Dickinson and even Hunters have to be to ensure that the look and feel of the show works seamlessly?
Well, we spent great amount of time discussing the tone that we want to create for the show, and then each of us goes off into our research and finds the mood. It's not just the right silhouette. It's not just it's the way that you present the colors. And we each went off, the production designer for both shows, actually, for Dickinson and Hunters. Everybody went off and did their research, and then we come together and explore together what it is that we've found and what really speaks to the story that we're telling. Because ultimately, to me, it's not about, as you say, it's not about bonnets and pretty bows. There's a story being told, and the story needs, the support of the costumes. What has to happen is for the audience has to feel comfortable that you are creating a world that they can sink into. And so it's important not to do anything too jarring, unless it's intentional. It's more important that you create this world for them to access and then explore the story that the writer has created.
So on Hunters, you're working in a completely different aesthetic. It's the 70s, which is a bit more recent, obviously, than the 1850s. So there's a lot more to draw on, and there's a lot more probably pressure to get it right. So how difficult is it to get a 70s period piece right, particularly on a show like Hunters, which is a bit more elevated than your standard 70s period piece?
Yes, we definitely, it's a serious piece, Hunters is, and I think I was very much aware that I didn't want to do what can often slip into comical or too lighthearted. The 70s clothing was, very exuberant. And I think it's a pitfall that happens sometimes with designing in the 70s, that the clothing is so much fun that you want to have like a lot of fun with the clothing and go, look at this crazy outfit they wore. Yeah. And I think that was very important to avoid on Hunters, as it's a provocative piece and very serious. Obviously, it's got comic elements to it, but the overall feeling of it is quite serious. I think I did have a little advantage in the fact that I actually moved to New York myself in 1976. And so I pretty much sort of in my DNA as a young man, I moved to New York and was just soaking up New York. And so it's actually been often a difficult period for me to watch on other projects, because I was there, I know what it looked like, and I very much wanted to bring that knowledge to Hunters, because it takes place almost exactly when I first arrived in New York, and I just remember it so well.
What a great opportunity to be able to get the chance to build a world that you can kind of recall from your younger days. I mean, it's a completely different work for you, because in Dickinson, you were researching an old period. This one, obviously, it's speculative fiction because it's about, these Nazis who were trying to build another Reich, but you're still having it grounded in reality. So can you point to any particular look from Hunters where you felt really proud that you had created something quite authentic?
Well, I guess, creating the looks for each of the hunters themselves was something that I found very satisfying, because I wanted them to look completely real. I mean, they had to completely meld into the environments of Brooklyn and New York and Manhattan. But on the other hand, I wanted each of them to have sort of an iconic look. So where I went with that was just taking each of them and sort of doing a very sort of simplistic but simple look for them, a sort of simple look for them that really sort of they carry throughout the entire season. But I didn't want it to look in any way like cartoony or anything like that. There are fantastical elements that we portray in the show. So I thought it was very important when we were in the real world that we were very grounded. And yet I wanted each of them to be very distinctive and have a very a silhouette that you recognize them from immediately.
Yeah. You know, a lot of us will probably understand what a costume designer does pre-production when you're designing the actual clothing and the looks and the silhouettes for the show. But many people don't quite understand the daily challenges that you would have and your department has during production. Can you point to any specific challenges that you find you generally have on different projects?
I would say it's just having to be in many places at the same time. We map out what the costume will be for an actor and what they'll be wearing, and in any particular scene or for any particular episode. But in order to make it really work beautifully, you have to be there in the moment when the costume gets established on the set, because the actor may have discovered something new about the character at the last minute, and really it may impact his hair, it may impact her outfit, and you need to be there. So I always make sure that I'm always on the set whenever any actor gets established. But simultaneously, you have to be prepping the rest of the show. So casting for many of the characters doesn't happen until whilst you're filming. And so you're constantly fitting new characters, creating new looks, but at the same time, you have to be on set. So it's just a delicate balancing act. And I have the great good fortune to also have a very good team that works with me. So, and with the miracle of technology today too, I can be at fittings and be on set at the same time.
Yeah, that's generally pretty helpful. Let's talk about awards for a little while, because obviously that's what Gold Derby is most excited about. You've got 6 Emmy nominations. Your first one was in 2008 for Mad Men, and then you received nominations for Boardwalk Empire, which to me is some of your best work. I love the costumes on that show. And you were nominated 5 years in a row from 2011, which is an achievement in itself. So I always ask this question for people who've been nominated more than once. What's more exciting, the first nomination, the second one where you are like, that this is a pat on the back because we love you and want you to come back, or 5 years in a row and you're still being nominated 6 or 7 years later? Like, what is the most exciting when it comes to nominations?
I suppose the later nominations in the sequence, you of course, never get tired of getting nominated. It's a lovely nod. And then also, each season you're going up against different shows, and the terrain is changing. So there'll be new things that are up here on the horizon, and and so your show has to, be up to snuff every single year. Every single year, you're being examined yet again, and of course you're doing different things in every season too. So I would say that if you can maintain nominations throughout your entire season, that just does get more and more exciting.
Yeah, and I am also really curious to know about your work on Boardwalk. There were so many different looks from that show as the show progressed over the years. Is there any one particular costume or design that you will always look back on and think that is my favorite from that show?
I would say, there were 2 different things. First of all, I just really, really loved dressing Steve Buscemi as Nucky. And I will say that because it was a moment where you have an actor that is so brilliant, but nobody would ever have suspected he would play such a part. And to help him create the visual of that part, it really was exciting. I mean, part of the reason I got into costume design is you know, without having to appear on screen, you really kind of get to play each character a little bit. You have to imagine what that character chose to wear that day, what they chose, what they wanted to show the world, what they didn't want to show the world. And I was just really tickled that Steve Buscemi proved to be such an unexpected choice for that role, and by creating a whole strong visual for him, we helped the audience see that he could play a part such as that. But then, you know, there were many other moments that I loved doing in the show, and Chalky White was always a delight to do as well. But the men's clothing was fun.
It was pretty fun. My final question is a general one about costume design and how they're awarded. Something that I'm always really fascinated about, and when I get to speak to costume designers, I usually ask this. So when I look back at the Oscars, for example, most of the time, the films that win, or even at the Emmys, the productions that win are the ones with the most costumes. So they're usually Victorian or Elizabethan or the period. Sometimes you'll get something from the 70s or something from outer space. And every once in a while, you'll see a nomination for contemporary work, which is what I'm most excited about. Like, one that springs to mind is Antonella Canarozzi, who designed the clothes on I Am Love about 10 years ago. So I was just wondering, as someone who works in this industry, and you've been working for a very long time, you have a lot of experience, what do you classify as really exceptional costume design when you're maybe voting for an award for your guild or for an academy?
Yes. Well, we have a joke in the costume world where we say, you know, when it comes to the awards, it's the oldest costumes win, meaning, you know, if you're set in 1850 and all the other shows are set in 1920, the 1850 show is going to win. Yeah. However, you know, for me, really, the success is if the costume designer is supporting the story that is being told. And sometimes that does involve very theatrical or very audacious or very, you know, lavish costumes. But sometimes, you know, it's the quiet costumes that are really the ones that are telling the story. Frankly, my moment when I decided that I was really interested in costume design was when I saw Midnight Cowboy, and Rob had done the costumes for that. And I was sitting there, and halfway through it, I went, "Oh my God, I understand really these characters, none of which I'm, you know, was back in the Midwest in a suburban setting. I didn't know any of these characters, but looking at the clothing that she had done for Midnight Cowboy, I really understood the characters in a way that, and I realized the heavy lifting she was doing and helping to create these characters. And so I thought that was just an eye-opening lightning bolt moment for me. And so although I do really love doing period costumes, to me it's really much more about telling the story and doing it as and it's more important for me to work with interesting filmmakers who are telling a good story, and what can my costumes do to help support them.
Yeah, I think that's probably the key. John, that was really fascinating. Thank you so much for your time. Good luck at the Emmys. Who knows what will happen later this year, and in the meantime, good luck with that.
Well, thank you, Robert, and it was a pleasure talking with you.
Now, everybody, go to goldderby.com right now while you're still here. We're staying home. You might as well watch all of our chats. So click subscribe, make your predictions, and stick with Gold Derby. We have plenty more chats to come.